As part of this module, we shall be working with the Linux operating system via the command line interface or CLI. If you have previous experience of working with Linux OS over command line, then that's great. However, in case if you've never worked with it or if you don't even know what a command line over Linux means, don't worry. That's exactly why I'm here for. I shall teach you the basics right from the scratch. Before I teach you the Linux or command line, in this section, let's learn how an operating system works. These basics are applicable to all types of OS such as Linux, Mac OS X, and even Windows too. Let us start with the structure. Here is a diagram showing the structure of an operating system. As you can see, the central layer is the hardware. This is the physical system that does the computation in binary. However, the hardware layer only understands binary, that is, ones and zero. We engineers like to simplify things, and thus we added a new layer called as the kernel layer on top of the hardware layer. It translates your language to ones and zeros and vice versa, among other things. A kernel acts as an interface between a user application and the hardware. The sole aim of kernel is to manage the communication between the software, which are the user-level applications, and the hardware, which is like the CPU, disk memory, etc. And one of the most popular kernel is Linux. Look around yourself and you'll find Linux OS everywhere. Your Android phones use Linux OS. Linux remains the go-to choice for cloud, with 75% of enterprise reporting that they use Linux as their primary cloud platform. These numbers compare to fewer than 24% using Windows and less than 2% using Unix to support the cloud. In a computer, the kernel is not of much use by itself. So, it's typically bundled with a bunch of useful utilities and interfaces. This collection of utilities and interfaces is called a distribution. Now, the layer above the kernel is called the command line or the command line interface. This is a text-based application for viewing, handling, and manipulating files on your computer. It is much like the Windows Explorer or Finder on the Mac, but without the graphical interface. Other names for the command line are CMD, CLI, prompt, console, or terminal. The layer above command line is the GUI or the graphical user interface. Every time an action is done in GUI, example, you click a mouse, it converts that action to an instruction which is sent via command line. So for every GUI action, there is a command line instruction, but not vice versa. The command line layer is comparatively easy to communicate with since you speak to it in English-like language commands. Also, since this layer is close to the hardware than GUI, it is much more powerful than the GUI. Remember that the same kernel Linux can be used in many different distributions like Ubuntu, Android OS, Debian, Mint, etc., each bundled with different utilities and interfaces. So you can say that Ubuntu is built on top of Linux, and most of the commands that are supported by Linux are supported by all these distributions like Ubuntu, Fedora, Elementary OS, etc. as well. I hope this gives you a brief idea about how an OS and Linux works, as well as gives you a brief idea on how the command line works. In the next section, we shall learn a few more interesting facts about the Linux operating system and why it is so revolutionary.